parking lot bridge is such a cool place.
To bed about 12, and I got up at 4.
And it was a form.
No, I can't do it anymore.
So you could actually
I was on the,
get around a little bit.
I'm from California.
Yes, it was. That was a vastly different world than we have now.
Just could not sleep that night. You know, the time.
From the travel, yeah, and the traveling.
Good morning.
So you were stormed out last night too for a while? Huge storm. That's what my wife said.
Storm last. Storm
You ready?
2 hours.
Morning. I'm David Lebron, the president of Rice University. We'd like to welcome Commission on Federal Election Reform, witnesses, and other participants to these proceedings. We're very pleased to host them at Rice University and at the James A. Baker III Institute for Public Policy. I'd like to also acknowledge the presence of Ambassador Ed Jerigian, the director of the Baker Institute for Public Policy. Please now to turn the proceedings over to Secretary Baker.
Thank you, David. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Baker Institute. Let me just say a word or two before I turn the floor over to President Carter. Unfortunately, today in our politics, there's a distinct absence of bipartisanship. We see a little bit of it when we see President Bush, number 41, and President Clinton playing golf. We see a lot more of it when we look at the makeup of this commission and when we consider what we're striving to do here. Unfortunately, it seems to be the case that the bipartisanship takes place after you're out of power, and we're interested in trying to come up with some proposals for improving our federal election process that can be agreed to by both Democrats and Republicans. We're extraordinarily pleased to have President Carter here at the Baker Institute. I want to recall an incident that took place when I was Secretary of State that I think speaks to President Carter's commitment to bipartisanship. We were dealing with an extraordinarily difficult issue of the wars in Central America. It was a domestic political issue in the United States. It was the holy grail of the left in this country, and it was the holy grail of the right. And we made a decision at the time we came into office in 1989 that if we could remove that problem from domestic politics, we could solve the foreign policy part of the problem. And we did so through cooperation with former President Jimmy Carter, who joined a number of observers down there to observe an election that flowed from a bipartisan accord on Central America negotiated with the Democratic leadership of Congress by the Republican executive branch. President Carter called me at about 4 o'clock in the morning after the election down there in Central America, which had been won by Violeta Chamorro. The leader, the party in power at the time were the Sandinistas under Daniel Ortega. And President Carter said, I'm going to do my best to get Daniel Ortega to observe the results of this election. And he did so. And without that, we would never have been able, in my opinion, to deal with the Central American problem and remove it from the domestic politics of the United States. So, Mr. President, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to the Baker Institute, and I know it's your hope, as it is mine, that we can find a broad degree of consensus on some of these issues and provide a report to the policymakers in Washington that will enable us to improve our federal election process. Welcome.
Thank you, Chair. Well, I want to add just I've been out of office now for a quarter of a century or so, and there's never been an official in Washington since I left office with whom I worked more harmoniously and pleasantly than Jim Baker when he was Secretary of State. I remember that particular election, which was brought an end to the so-called Contra War. The war was still going on in the northern area of Nicaragua, and we had gotten Daniel Ortega and Mrs. Chamorro to hug and kiss each other and to agree on a statement. And I woke up Jim Baker at 4 o'clock in the morning, as he said, and gave him the good news that the war was over and the election was successful, and that the two antagonists in the war had agreed to make a statement at 6 o'clock in the morning, and I hoped that Washington would not make a negative statement, but would make a positive statement. And he asked me, well, what should we say? And so I said, do you have a pencil and paper there? So I gave him a few notes, and simultaneously at 6 o'clock the morning after the election, statements came out in Nicaragua from both sides and Washington that they were harmonious in nature. But there were other times as well, and since then I've been very pleased to join in this partnership. 4 years ago, at about this same time, President Gerald Ford and I headed a similar commission following the 2000 election and problems in Florida primarily. And we made recommendations to the President and to the Congress, and out of that, the legislation was passed encompassing a substantial portion of what we recommended. As we've seen since then, that legislation has been very good, but needs to be strengthened. And there are some elements already in the law, including that and the 2005 bill that's passed with the Real ID and the census that we have every 10 years. Those kinds of things are amenable to improving dramatically the number of people who are registered to vote and the ability to certify that people who come to vote are honestly on the list, and that legislation and procedures are at least tentatively approved, whereby the voting procedures can be honest and trusted. This commission, I think, is very important, and we'll be making our recommendations to the Congress and to the President in September, as you all know. So I'm very pleased to be here today as co-chairman with Jim Baker in this beautiful hall, which is a tribute to one of the finest public servants that our country's ever seen, Jim Baker. Now, Bob Pastor, who's Executive Director of the Commission, will give a few remarks, and we'll proceed with our program. Bob?
Thank you very much, President Carter and Secretary Baker. Thank you, David LeBron and Rice University, and Ambassador Dirigian, the Executive Director of the Baker Institute, for hosting this second meeting of the Commission on Federal Election Reform. We are here in part because of support from numerous foundations that I would like to acknowledge as well. Carnegie Corporation of New York and Jerry Mannion is here. We're very grateful for your leadership on this. Michael Caudell Fagan from Pew Trust, which has helped us through through election line, and its director, Doug Chapin, who is the research director of the Commission. We also have been supported by the Ford Foundation, the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, and the Omidyar Network. And so we're very grateful for all of you. Since the last meeting of the Commission at American University, which is organizing this commission on April 18th, we have been in touch with many members of Congress and their staff to solicit their testimony and their views. Our commission members, who are former members of Congress, Senator Daschle, Representative Bob Michael, Representative Susan Molinari, and Representative Lee Hamilton, have met with Rush Holt, who has introduced a bill, and members of staff to discuss these issues. We have met with numerous advocacy groups that are very concerned and involved in the electoral process to get their views, including yesterday. I participated briefly in a forum, an all-day forum, by the election assessment hearings, and many of the members are here today. We're very interested in the concerns of the public. Those are the concerns that we share. At the last meeting, we focused on some of the problems that we've seen in the electoral process. In this meeting, our focus is going to be on not only analyzing those problems, but by thinking about ways to improve that. We have 9 people who will be testifying between now and noon, and very little time. And so we ask you to hold your presentations for a maximum of 10 minutes. At 8 minutes, the little yellow light will go off in the forest over there. We ask you to bring your remarks to a conclusion at that time. At 10 minutes, the red light will go off. Thank you. Secretary Baker will be chairing these sessions.
Thank you very much, Bob. Ladies and gentlemen, our first panel this morning is dealing with voter registration, voter identification, and participation. And our first expert presenter is Mr. Ken Smuckler of Information Voting Technologies, and he will be talking to us about findings from the 2004 election.
Thank you, President Carter, Secretary Baker, distinguished commission members, staff, and guests. My name is Ken Smuckler. I am president of InfoVoter Technologies. Let me take you back to Sunday, October 24th, 2004. Day one, NBC News launches its promotion of the National Election Hotline 1-866-MY-VOTE-1 across its cable properties, excuse me, owned and operated stations and affiliates. Day one marked the culmination of months of works by the MyVote1 consortium. The University of Pennsylvania Fells Institute of Government, the Reform Institute, the Common Cause Education Fund, the Hispanic Voter Project at Johns Hopkins University, and the National Constitution Center. Tuesday, October 26, 2004, day three. Responding to a reporter's inquiry regarding the nature of call traffic already on the MyVote1 hotline, I give the following statement that appears in the Philadelphia Inquirer. Quote, of the 2,000 Florida calls we've taken so far, the lion's share is coming out of Broward. That might change, although it's a little late for Broward to be handing out absentee ballots. Day four, NBC6, the local NBC affiliate in South Florida, runs a story based on the MyVote1 data raising the concern that absentee ballots are missing in Broward County. Day five, the Florida Sun-Sentinel, citing activity on the MyVote1 hotline and its companion 1-866-Our Vote, runs a story entitled, Broward to Resend Thousands of Missing Absentee Ballots. The story led with these words. Hoping to avoid another presidential election fiasco, Broward County officials scrambled Wednesday to replace tens of thousands of missing absentee ballots, cut long waits for early voting, and beef up a phone system deluged with calls from angry voters. Broward County 2004 is a cautionary tale for election officials. In just 5 days of operation, an election monitoring station in Philadelphia identified problems arising in a county in South Florida, triggering a series of events that ultimately forced Broward County to take actions that, in the absence of such a system, may never have been taken. As technology can empower voters during the election process, it equally empowers all of us in the business of trying to improve the system of elections after the polls are closed. As of midnight Election Day, November 2nd, 2004, the MyVote1 hotline had taken over 208,000 calls, processed over 102,000 poll location inquiries, attempted to transfer over 96,000 calls to local boards of election, and captured over 55,000 audio recordings of voters in distress. Its companion, the Our Vote hotline, took an additional 205,000 calls and processed an additional 54,000 poll location inquiries. Secretary Baker, your statement following the April 18th hearing was right on point. First, it would be cynical and indeed flawed to assume that all of the low-hanging fruit had been picked in HAVA. Second, there is more that we can do. For the data generated by the National Election Hotlines leads to one inescapable conclusion. More voters are let down by our failure to communicate basic information to them in the days leading up to Election Day than are let down by the cumulative breakdowns in machines, provisional balloting, identification requirements, fraud, and intimidation. Put another way, if all we did was figure out a way for voters to receive the most basic of electoral information in the days leading up to an election, if all we did was give voters the answers to two basic questions, am I registered to vote and where do I vote, we would do more to support the franchise in the U.S. than all of the HAVA reforms combined. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the low-hanging fruit that remains to be picked. Of the 208,524 calls logged into the MyVote1 system, 102,058, or 49%, simply needed to know where their poll location could be found. Of the 205,877 calls into Our Vote, 54,778, or 28%, selected the poll finder option. The magnitude of the problem can be seen in the internet traffic on Election Day running to mypollingplace.com, a national poll locator website supported by InfoVoter. This website received over 3 million hits on Election Day. Of the 55,000 complaints we recorded over the MyVote1 hotline, calls that came from every state in the U.S., registration problems far outpaced any other problem type. The data distributes the calls by problem type as follows. Ballot and screen problems, 0.54%. Coercion and intimidation, 0.6%. Mechanical problems, 2.38%. Provisional ballot problems, 4.67%. Poll access, 12.0%. Identification, 22.78%. Absentee, 24.49%. Registration, 32.47%. The overwhelming majority of callers citing registration as a problem simply did not know if, in fact, they were registered to vote. To really appreciate the devastating impact of registration breakdowns, I implore the members of this commission to listen to the voices of voters who first called the hotline just curious, next confused, then frustrated, and finally furious at a system that, through no fault of their own, failed them. I have said that many times that I am like the boy in the movie The Sixth Sense. I hear the voices of voters who, for all intents and purposes in the 2004 election, are dead. You should hear the voices too. How did the information infrastructure fail voters in 2004? A review of Secretaries of State websites finds only 9 that can get a voter from a street address to a poll location or provide registration information. I know of only a handful of county websites and no newspaper in the country that provides this information. The great irony is that on Election Day in America, it is easier to find the nearest vegetarian Chinese restaurant than your poll location. The bottom line, in 2004, a properly working phone system at the county or municipal board of election was a lifeline for voters in the days preceding the election. A dysfunctional phone system was, more often than not, a death sentence for the franchise. And in 2004, phone systems across the board failed. The MyVote1 hotline was built to enable callers to transfer to their local county board of election after they retrieved their poll location or registered their complaint. The interactive voice response system that processed their call was designed to recognize and tabulate whether the transferred call was picked up by the local board or was met by a busy signal or no answer. Of the 96,092 calls we attempted to transfer out of the MyVote1 system to a local county board of election, only 50,987, or 53%, were even answered. If we factor in those that were answered by a voicemail system and never processed by a live operator, only one conclusion becomes clear. On Election Day 2004, a voter placing a call to a local county board of election was more likely to get no one than get an answer. In the state of South Carolina alone, where we attempted to transfer 3,716 calls, only 652 transferred successfully. 82% of the calls transferred went unanswered. Moving forward. If phones are the problem, then phones must be part of the solution. If we ensure voters can access their poll location and registration status in an automated environment by phone, more will vote. It is that simple. There are promising signs on the horizon. The District of Columbia Board of Elections and Ethics, the first local board to offer voters a choice of DRE and optical scan voting at every poll location, has taken the lead in automating its phone system to include poll locator and registration functionality. The HAVA directors for the state of Delaware and New Jersey have asked to connect to the MyVote1 system to monitor Election Day call traffic. Today I have presented the Commission with a glimpse of the data generated by the MyVote1 and Our Vote hotlines, but it is just a glimpse. This data tells us things we may find intuitive, like 65% of the callers to the MyVote1 hotline were women, and some things that we may find counterintuitive. Like even in areas of high Latino concentration, only a relatively small percentage of callers chose the Spanish-speaking option. The MyVote1 database was designed to create a baseline against which future elections should be measured, a wealth of data to be mined for greater truths about the electorate and Election Day. So let us resolve to take one more step. Let us resolve to use this data as it was designed to be used. The Election Assistance Commission, fulfilling its clearinghouse role under the Help America Vote Act, should immediately acquire the MyVote1 and Our Vote data and use its resources to fund a comprehensive academic analysis of the data. In addition, the EAC should work to ensure online access to this data for state and local election board officials so that they can learn from the mistakes and successes of 2004. Again, there are promising signs on the horizon. Senator Dodd, Congressman Mel Watt, chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, as well as the National Conference of Black Mayors, have now called upon the EAC to access, analyze, and distribute the MyVote1 and Our Vote data. President Carter, Secretary Baker, and members of this commission, if we do not address the critical telecommunication failures of 2004, if we do not listen to the voice of the voters coming through this system and analyze this data in 2005, and if we do not move at the state level to make an automated poll location and registration phone system a reality by 2006, ours will not be a failure of technology. It will be a failure of leadership. Thank you.
Very much, Mr. Smuckler. Before we move to the next presenter, ladies and gentlemen, we have an extraordinarily distinguished commission, and I would like to have them introduce themselves now to the audience, both the television audience and the audience here in the hall. And we'll begin, if it's all right, with Betty Castor, who was the Democratic nominee for the United States Senate in 2004 in Florida. And as you introduce yourselves, members of the commission, please tell the audience what you do or what you have done. Betty Castor.
I'm currently the founder and president of the Campaign for Florida's Future, and developing a 501c3 charitable organization to address civic engagement. I'm an educator, former president of the University of South Florida, and commissioner of education. Thank you.
I'm Tom Phillips. I was a former trial judge here in Houston and then Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Texas. I've taught law for the past year in Houston, and beginning in September, I will be an attorney with Baker & Botts in Austin.
My name is Spencer Overton. I'm a law professor at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. I specialize in voting rights and in campaign finance, and right now I'm writing a book for W.W. Norton on voting rights.
My name is Vita DiMartino. I serve as Executive Vice Chair of the New York Republican State Party. I have a few presidential appointments, J. William Fulbright Foreign Scholarship Board, Inter-American Commission of Women, Inter-American Children's Institute, and I've been involved in politics all my life, and I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you.
I'm Jack Nelson. I've been a journalist for 50 years. I'm a former reporter and Washington bureau chief of the Los Angeles Times. I'm currently consultant on a movie for Showtime called The Orangeburg Massacre, based on a book I co-wrote with another person.
I'm Susan Molinari. I'm a former member of Congress from New York, a former member of the New York City Council. I now chair an organization called the Washington Group, a government affairs firm in D.C., and head up public affairs for Ketchum.
I'm Tom Daschle. I had the good fortune of representing South Dakota in the Congress, in the House, and the Senate, and the Democratic leader for the last 10 years. I now work with Alston and Bird, and it's a law firm in Washington, Intermedia Partners, an investment firm in New York, Georgetown University, and the Center for American Progress.
I'm Ben Ladner, president of American University and a professor of philosophy. I have chief responsibilities for finding faculty parking spaces.
Important.
How's it going?
I'm losing.
I'm Robert Pastor, and I wanted to thank President Benjamin Ladner for getting a parking space for me as a professor at American University. I'm vice president at American, as well as director of the Center for Democracy and Election Management, which is organizing this commission. And I was also standing next to President Carter in Nicaragua when he came up with the idea of calling Secretary of State Baker at 4 a.m. and said to him, I think, why don't we wait until 6 a.m.? And he said, I really think that Secretary Baker won't mind waking up at this hour with this news, and that proved to be the case. And Mr. Secretary, if I may, when we're finished introducing the members of the commission, I'd like to also introduce the staff.
Yes, I'll give you the floor to do that. Everybody knows the president, of course. My name is Jim Baker, and I want to thank David Liebran for giving me a parking place here at Rice University.
Well, now you all know what my responsibilities are. I'm David Liebran, president of Rice University. I was formerly dean of Columbia Law School and professor there.
I'm Bob Mosbacher, former Secretary of Commerce under President Bush 41, and former General Chairman of the Republican National Committee. But I've spent most of my life looking for and finding some domestic oil and gas properties so that we won't be so dependent on foreign sources, and trying to keep the price down.
I'm Bob Michael. I served in the House of Representatives from 18th District of Illinois for 38 years, the last 14 of which was Republican leader, and now currently associated with the law firm of Hogan and Hartson in Washington.
I'm Nelson Lund. I'm a law professor at George Mason University in Virginia. One of the areas I work in occasionally is election law, and I was fortunate to serve as Associate Counsel to President Bush 41.
I'm Shirley Malcolm. I head Education and Human Resources Programs and serve as Chair of the Center on Careers in Science and Technology at the American Association for the Advancement of Science. I was co-organizer of a AAAS conference to develop a research agenda on electronic voting technology. And I guess for these purposes, I'm also, I should say that I am Perez's distant bosses, since I also am a member of the Board of Trustees of Caltech. Mike.
I'm Ralph Monroe. I served and elected 5 terms, Secretary of State of Washington. I sit on numerous boards of directors, one of which is a company called Integrity, which works on voting technology. I am very involved as a volunteer. I spend a lot of my time now in Africa, in Ethiopia and Uganda doing volunteer work, and am involved as a school volunteer as well.
I'm Sharon Priest. I am currently the Executive Director of the Downtown Partnership in Little Rock. I am the former Arkansas Secretary of State. I served 2 terms, term limited, and was President of the National Association of Secretaries of State in 2000.
Good morning. My name is Raul Izaguirre. I'm currently Presidential Professor at Arizona State University, formerly the President and CEO of the National Council of La Raza.
Thank you very much. Bob, would you like to introduce the staff now?
Yes, and if they could stand as well. Daniel Callengard is the Associate Director of the Center for Democracy and Election Management. Doug Chapin is the Research Director of the Commission and Director of Election Line. John Williams, who has been working very closely with us as both assistant to Secretary Baker and assistant to the Commission. From American University, Murray Gormley, my executive assistant and really the person in charge of this whole operation. Kay Stimson, who's the Associate Director for the for Media Liaison of the Commission. Zach Bister, who is a undergraduate assistant who's been working with us this summer on this project. And at the Baker Institute, I'd like to acknowledge Sonia and Maggie Cryer, and of course Charlotte Cheadle as well, who's worked very closely with us and has supported us. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Now our next presenter, ladies and gentlemen, will be Professor Michael Alvarez, who's Professor of Political Science at Caltech. He will talk to us on voter registration and ID and the Help America Vote Act's strengths and weaknesses. Professor.
Thank you, Secretary Baker, and I want to thank the President Carter and the rest of the Commission, and certainly the staff of the Commission for inviting me to be here. I had testified before in the previous incarnation of this after the 2000 election at the Reagan Library in Simi Valley, which was a wonderful event, and as current co-director of the Caltech MIT Voting Technology Project, I certainly do enjoy the opportunity to work with the Commission because certainly the previous Commission was very influential and very important in moving forward the process of election reform. And I certainly anticipate that that'll be the case in coming years. It's going to be very difficult for me as a professor to talk for 10 minutes about something as important as voter registration. And it's also difficult for me not to be technologically handicapped here. So now that I know that I have one of my bosses, I'll have to be on notice that I'm going to have to be a good boy. But I've provided written testimony, and for members of the audience and others who aren't here, my written testimony is available on our website at vote.caltech.edu/reports. And if anybody has any trouble, just go to vote.caltech.edu and just send us an email or give us a call, and we can provide that for you. What I want to talk about today very briefly as a professor can, is why we do voter registration, some basic principles about voter registration, some of the contemporary issues associated with voter registration, attempts at reform, what HAVA tried to do, and where we're going to go from here, hopefully. So first off, why do we register voters? Well, interestingly enough, voter registration has existed in some way, shape, or form in the United States since the early 1800s. So it's not a new system, and it's certainly not a new problem. It's essentially used for 2 purposes. One, it's used to control who votes, because only people who are eligible to vote can register, and registration is an essential check on eligibility to deter many forms of voter fraud. It's also very critical for election management and for other election administration tasks. And as I've said in many forums, especially in the last few years, we've come to realize that voter registration is an essential backbone. It's basically the foundation for the election administration and the electoral process as we currently run it in the United States. Now, there's a whole series of principles regarding voter registration, things that a voter registration system should do. Certainly one thing that it should do is be easy and accessible for voters to navigate. The information in a voter registration system must be accurate and complete. It must be immune from fraud. It must be dynamic and up to date. And also, it must be usable by election administrators and increasingly by polling place workers. Now, we have a lot of contemporary issues with voter registration. Voter registration, as we've seen, was an important problem in 2000, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, and it certainly was an important problem in the 2004 election. The voter registration system as it stands today is essentially, for my colleagues in technology here at Rice or places like Caltech, an enormous, complex, massive, and dynamic database problem. It really essentially is a database problem. And unfortunately, after the National Voter Rights Act was passed, the Motor Voter Bill, which was a wonderful piece of legislation in many ways, it pushed the process out into the control or into the hands of many individuals and groups whom election administrators essentially have little control over. A lot of the election administration process of voter registration now is in the hands of third parties, groups that are helping people to register, or other governmental agencies that are basically providing the forms and serving as sort of the point person in the voter registration process. And that seems to maybe be leading to a number of problems associated with voter registration. Another important problem, and I think a problem that we're going to see increasingly as we move forward, is difficulties associated with deployment of the database on Election Day. As we move, again, I'll talk about this in a few minutes, more towards statewide voter files and the ability to use this data on Election Day in polling places. I think we're going to continue to see problems associated with that deployment. And also, I think the most important contemporary issue we face right now is the voter registration system or process has a lot of uncertainty associated with it right now because there are enormous changes being put in place in every state and every county associated with implementation and interpretation of the Help America Vote Act. So some reforms. The first important reform occurred in 1993, which was the NVRA, the Motor Voter Law, which was passed, to primarily establish some standards for purging and list maintenance. And as I said earlier, it allowed for third-party and increased access to voter registration materials at government agencies. And it also attempted to do other things to make the process easier, for example, by attempting to expand registration by mail. Now, in the 2000 election, which was the aftermath of which the Caltech-MIT Voting Technology Project got its start, we found that there were widespread problems with voter registration lists in the 2000 election. There were many questions associated with purging procedures that were used in states, and there were concerns about what actually happens with the voter registration applications that are coming from these third-party sources. From all the analyses that we did of the 2000 election, we estimated that as many as 2 million votes were lost due to bad technologies and ballot problems. Perhaps as many as 1.2 million votes were lost due to polling place problems. But surprisingly enough to the technologists on our project, up to 3 million votes were lost due to voter registration problems. So the bottom line was that we found that voter registration was the biggest problem associated with the 2000 election. Now, where did these problems come from in the voter registration system? Well, it appears that they came mainly from errors in voter registration databases. So there was data entered into the database that was incorrect. Problems somehow in handling or processing of voter registration materials, or difficulties that voters themselves faced with updating their voter registration status, for example, after a move. And again, voter registration, according to our work, was the most significant problem in the 2000 election. Now, HAVA passed in 2002, attempted to mitigate or eliminate most of those types of problems. It also attempted to simultaneously make the voter registration process more secure. HAVA implemented nationwide provisional balloting. It is pushing states to move towards statewide voter registration lists. It's telling states that they have to include some sort of identifying data or information about voters in their registration files. And of course, new voter registration applicants have to provide some form of registration, even if they, or some form of identification, even if they register by mail. Now, in my written testimony, I identified 4 major areas where we think additional work and additional reforms need to be done. And I'm going to outline those here. The first thing is, obviously, we need to continue efforts to make the process simultaneously more secure and easier for voters to access. We need to move towards systems that allow voters to use technology to maintain and to update and check their voter registration status. We need to move towards additional reforms that will minimize barriers and other types of deadlines that voters face for voter registration. And again, we need to continue research efforts in particular, to figure out how to use the new statewide voter registration lists to increase the integrity and the accuracy and the security of the lists themselves. Second, we certainly need to fix provisional balloting. Provisional balloting, it's not clear that it worked as was intended in some states in 2004, and many of us are still collecting data on what happened there. There needs to be more flexibility for voters who are voting in the wrong precinct, and we need to make sure that the provisional balloting process itself is more usable and more effective. We need to really carefully scrutinize what states are doing with their statewide voter registration lists. That's my third point. We need standards for these files. We need to move towards common data exchange formats for these files. We need to figure out how these files can be used in precincts. We need to figure out how accurate these files are and how their data can be used in post-election auditing practices. These databases need to be made more flexible so that they can be updated and used for future applications that we may not be able to foresee now. And we also need some definitive interpretations of what the HAVA requirements are. Last, we need more research on the impact of the voter identification requirements in HAVA. Are these requirements increasing security, and are they increasing the integrity of the process? Different states have implemented different types of rules, and we need more data and more information about how effective they are. We also need a better understanding of the extent to which these rules themselves may be imposing additional barriers for new voters as they come to register. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. The next presenter is Dr. Paula Hawthorne, who's a consultant on database development, and she will speak to us about voter registration databases.
Thank you. My name is Paula Hawthorne. I received my PhD in electrical engineering and computer science from UC Berkeley a very long time ago, and have since then, for the most part, been running software development groups for database startups. I'm now retired. I volunteer most of my time to various organizations. I very occasionally teach a database course at UC Berkeley, and I even more occasionally consult. As a part of my volunteer work with an Association of Computer Professionals, the ACM, I've been looking into the HAVA-mandated statewide voter registration databases. Today, I've been asked to come and talk to you about the potential for the interoperability of these databases, and I thank you for this opportunity. The statewide voter registration databases are being implemented with mostly different vendors, with different database designs, different database system software, and different hardware. I want to emphasize that there is a great strength in this diversity. This means that no single hacker attack, no single bug, no single failure of service is going to bring down the whole system. That is a very good thing. This is good for reliability, security, and privacy. However, this diversity comes at a cost, and that cost is increased complexity and interoperability. In computer science database research, this type of system, when we try to get it to operate together, is called a loosely coupled federated heterogeneous database system. It's loosely coupled because the system is composed of separate independent entities. It's heterogeneous because all the entities are different. Research on how to make a loosely coupled federated heterogeneous database system interoperate first began 30 years ago, and it is for the most part a solved problem. There are three parts to the solution: the control structure, the interconnecting network, and the software interconnection modules that act as the glue connecting the systems. I could talk for days about how to do this. I am originally from Texas, and I can talk for days about a lot of things. And I have some of the details in my written testimony. But once you have all of those parts working together, and I'd be happy to talk with you about how to do that, it's not hard. There is the harder, larger task of getting all the parts to do something useful. If you think of the databases as 50 different people, or 50 different people plus the 4 territories, many speaking different languages, getting the mechanics of the interoperation done is necessary to get all those people in one room. But then we have to get them to do the same task. This requires an agreed-upon, mandated common language, what Michael just referred to as a common data exchange format, and tasks to do. This isn't that hard. I would take the people who are doing the really good work on the voter registration databases. A guy from Rhode Island, the IT director there, is excellent. The woman from Oregon is really good. The guy from Arizona is great. I would take those people, put them in a room, give them 3 days, and say, come out with a data exchange format. Please don't spend millions of dollars doing this. It's not that hard. And I would build this federated voter registration system very slowly, starting with simple tasks first. If you remember anything at all from my testimony, please remember to not do the might as wells. You know what a might as well is if you have ever remodeled a house. As long as you're doing the kitchen, you might as well do the bathroom. As long as you're doing the downstairs bathroom, you might as well do the upstairs bathroom. Might as wells kill projects. Might as wells blow your budget. Might as wells make designs very awful. Don't do the might as wells. What I would do if I were you is I would start with automatic re-registration. That's because it is a fairly simple task. With automatic re-registration, and if you don't worry about fraud, and we'll talk about fraud in a second, if we rely on the voter to notify the state that they are moving, then all the voter registration office has to do is to send a file of the moving voters to the right state, send it maybe on a weekly basis, doesn't have to be interactive. And the reason I steer away from interactive, putting all those voter registration databases on the internet for interactive use, I think would open them up to hackers. So I would send the files. The states receiving the automatic additions would perhaps require different data. Some states require the entire birth date, some's only the day and year, day and month, not the year. And some data might not be easily translatable between systems. The one data item which might not be easily translatable is many states are capturing an image of the signature. They capture an image of the signature because they use that to verify absentee ballots. So that one item, you might have to ask the voter to send it back. If you require a signature and the state they came from didn't, you might have to send a note out to the voter to say, send this back. But as long as fraud's not an issue, automatic re-registration can be done fairly simply. Now, if fraud is an issue, we can certainly imagine a scheme where someone decides to move a group of voters from one state to another without the voters knowing that's being done. Either all the states would need to store signature images, and that's actually what I think would be a good idea, or there needs to be some form of what you might call a password that a voter knows and only they know, so they can say, yes, I am the one who is sending this. Another application for these federated voter registration databases, a second application, is detecting fraud. where someone is trying to either register or to vote in multiple elections. This is more complex than the first one because it's going to require a single database to do all those comparisons. You really can't be sending the voter registration databases from each state to all the other states to compare. You need a central repository. This central repository would be like 300 million voters or some number like that. That's really not big. There are many bigger databases. Scientific databases go into the terabytes, and I have lots of references on that. We know how to do this. The problem is not the size. The problem is the complexity of figuring out that it is the same person. If John Smith is trying to vote in Kentucky, how do you know it's not the same John Smith trying to vote in Alaska? In order to figure this out is going to require some means of identifying that person. Actually, right now, the voter registration databases in every state keep track of whether or not you have voted in a given election. So rather than trying to figure out if someone has registered in multiple elections, what we need to do is to figure out if they've tried to vote in multiple elections. And you say, well, why do it that way? And the reason is because there's lots of people on the list that have been on the list for a long time after they've moved. What you're really interested in is whether they tried to vote a second time. So I would concentrate on those people. And in order to do that, in order to know if it's the same person, you need some means of unique identification. You have that in their signature. When I retired 5 years ago, the signature analysis that people could do by computer was as good as fingerprint analysis. I bet it's better today. If I were to choose, I would say use the signature. If you can't use the signature, or for some reason the signature is not a viable technology, then the only other solution I see is to have some form of unique identification for individuals. I really would hate to recommend a national ID card. Like I said, I'm from Texas. We're kind of independent here. But nevertheless, there needs to be some unique identification for people. That is the major problem. It's not a problem of interoperability. It's a problem of the actual implementation of the system. Finally, I wanted to say that although we know how to do these federated, loosely coupled, heterogeneous database systems, we also know that in operation they can be very slow. They can be very slow if people are trying to synchronize between all the systems in real time. Don't do that. And that's my final bit of advice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hawthorne. And our last presenter this morning will be Professor Robert Stein, who's the Dean of Social Sciences here at Rice University, and he's going to talk to us about expanding voter participation. Bob?
Thank you, Secretary Baker, President Carter, and members of the Commission. I am the Dean of the School of Social Sciences, and I have the solution to parking. I ride a bicycle to work. I am a member of the Commission's Academic Advisory Committee, and along with my colleagues, Jen Ligley at the University of Arizona and Chris Owens at Texas A&M, we prepared a report for you on convenience voting in April. Today and this morning, I'd like to talk to you briefly about our report dealing with why voters vote or don't vote and what might be done about it. This is some new research we're also conducting on a famous Larimer, Colorado case. By way of background, and there's lots of research on this, of which Michael has contributed greatly, one simple way to understand this problem is to think of the fact that only 60% at the highest point of our eligible electorate participates in the quadrennial presidential election. Considerably fewer, sometimes single digits, participate in elections between each of these presidential elections in a 4-year cycle. Curiously, however, more than 90% of the eligible electorate voted in at least one election between 2000 and 2004. Moreover, many who vote in low-turnout school board elections do not show up for the presidential election, 17% to be precise. Why? And what does this suggest about the determinants of who votes and what we might do about it? Our explanation and recommendation suggests that the institutional changes in the way we conduct and administer our elections are not sufficient to increase turnout and enhance the representativeness of our electorate. Institutional reforms are neither self-implementing nor sufficient to connect voters to the political process and reduce the cost and inconvenience of voting. My colleagues and I believe there may be ways to use political parties and candidates to implement electoral reform in a manner that both reduces the cost and inconveniences of voting and helps voters connect themselves and their interests to the political process. Consider that there are myriads of reasons why people don't vote. Rules and procedures, the resources they have to overcome some of the costs of voting, their psychological attachment to government, civic engagement in general, and yes, the activities of political parties and candidates. The cost of voting and the inconvenience associated with it is difficult. In fact, it's interesting to note that in 2004, the current population survey identified the following reasons for not voting: too busy, conflicting demands, and inconvenience as the modal reasons for not voting. 26% cited those reasons. In 2000, only 15% cited those reasons. The inconvenience, the difficulty of finding your voting place, many of the things that others have spoken about here can be an obstacle. We've endeavored over the last 10 or 15 years, as Michael has suggested, to try to reduce those costs. Curiously, however, efforts to reduce the cost and inconvenience of voting, and this includes relaxed voter registration requirements under motor voter, easy or absentee voting, election day voter registration, early voting, voting by mail, have not increased turnout. And in fact, there's some evidence to suggest that not only have these reforms not increased turnout, but they've actually further skewed the electorate to be wealthier, to be older, to be frankly whiter. Ironically, our efforts haven't worked. Second, there's the belief that psychological attachments, efficacy, trust in government drive people to or away from the polling booths. It's simply not true. There's no definitive evidence that people who are efficacious or more trusting of government are more or less likely to vote. Yes, people who are interested, knowledgeable, and connected to politics are more likely to vote, but again, this may be simply because high-status individuals are more likely to be engaged in social interactions with each other, and they simply reinforce the norm of participation. Older, wealthier, and better educated people participate, but it may not just be because they can bear the costs of voting. They may have a norm, a value that they reinforce. Lastly, and that's something that's been absent from our discussions, political parties matter. They do drive turnout. They do so because they want to win elections. Political parties operate in several ways to enhance voter turnout. First, they cue voters about how competitive an election is, and therefore allow individuals to more accurately predict the probability that their vote might be decisive or at least more influential. Second, political parties tell us the difference between candidates. Negative campaigning works. When you make a statement about your opponent, whether we like it or not, it informs the voter about something they care about. And negative campaigning has been shown, when it's germane to the voter's interests, to turn out a voter. Mobilization efforts convey several types of information and thus increase the perceived benefits and reasons for voting. Electoral, and this is the most important one, if nothing else, this is the point we want to make, electoral reforms intended to increase voter turnout are not self-actuating. That is, the implementation of electoral reforms requires agents, political parties, and candidates. Government does a lot of things, and when they pass laws, they often implement those laws. Elections are one of the few laws, as you heard from the first speaker, that we don't implement very well. We rely on the political parties to do what? To mobilize our voters. We have found strong evidence for this thesis. Without the efforts of the political parties and their candidates, electoral reforms are likely to continue to have very marginal effects on turnout. Our study of turnout in the Texas 2000 election, gubernatorial election to be specific, we found that the influence of in-person or early voting was quite positive and dependent on positive on turnout, but it was dependent on whether the political elites, the party officials and the candidates, chose to take advantage of these rules and integrate them into their campaign strategies. Voter turnout increases when political parties and their candidates incorporate early voting into their campaign activities. Candidates and political parties can help voters make a meaningful link between their personal interests and values and the political process. The problem? Finding a way to effectively reduce the cost and inconvenience of voting, and also helping voters become engaged in the political process. That is, how do we better leverage the political parties and the candidates? They're going to do what they do anyway. How do we use our reforms to get the parties and the candidates to leverage some of these reforms for turnout? One suggestion: election day voting centers. The popularity of early voting and other forms of convenience voting by mail, for instance, suggests that many voters prefer the convenience afforded by early voting. Accessible voting locations, short lines, and assistance to use unfamiliar or complicated electronic voting schemes. Think of this as Walmart. McDonald's, fries if you're from Texas. People want to drive to a place where there's good parking, not wait in long lines, and not have someone who's not as familiar with the electric equipment as nonpartisan, professionally trained people might be. Election centers are not widely used. In fact, we've basically found them to exist in one county in Colorado, Larimer. Some of you remember this from the April meeting. My colleagues and I took it upon ourselves to look at Larimer more carefully. Election day centers operate in Larimer County the same way they operate in early voting. They are centrally located to populations, they're large, they're fewer in number, and they're staffed with professionally trained people who know how to operate the equipment. Question, and you'll see it in Figure 1, whether or not these election centers on election day actually help increase turnout. Let me just say here that this is very tentative findings. I would not want to go to the American Political Science Review with this paper for peer review yet, but the evidence, frankly, is much greater than I would have thought and my colleagues. Figure 1 simply plots for primary elections between 1990 and 2005 turnout rates in Larimer, which had election day voting centers, and a county just south of it called Weld. I hope I have the geography right. I think it's just south. It might be just east. The two counties become a nice control group, right? The Weld. It's exactly the same in size and composition. They had the same statewide races, Salazar, and of course other races during that period. Here's what's interesting, and the table's not quite as clear. Turnout rates in Larimer and Weld were running the same way, up and down, depending on what the races were. But Weld generally always had a higher voter turnout. In 2000, that flipped. It flipped, and it flipped in a statistically significant way. For Michael, who will tell you ecological correlation's dangerous here, this is not something you want to go to the bank on, but it suggests that these election centers had an increase on turnout comparable to what we would be seeing or expecting to see with election day registration. It's at least worth looking at. My suggestion here and the recommendations of my colleagues is that election centers are not a panacea, but they work well. Remember in my testimony here that the people who vote on election day are different than the people that vote early. They are younger, less connected to partisan politics, less connected and interested in politics. The people that vote on election day are what we might call intermittent voters. It may very well be like going to McDonald's and Walmart, they need a little help. Here's the other piece of evidence. It's anecdotal. We called the party chairmen in Larimer County and asked them, how was it that turnout actually ticked up before the implementation, but after the adoption of election centers? And it's always great for a college professor to talk to people who really work in the real world and drive cars. They said, well, of course, we anticipated the change. And we surely didn't, one Republican told me, we surely didn't know what the Democrats were going to do. And like the arms war, we weren't going to wait. We did a dress rehearsal. The point is, it's sort of like moral jujitsu. If you use these reforms to take advantage of the self-interest of the parties, they don't want to turn out voters, they want to win elections. They're not here to make democracy more representative. They're here to win elections. To do that, I think the kinds of election reforms we're talking about might be worth looking at. I want to also thank the Campaign Products of Colorado. They gave us this data for free. It's really expensive. They sell it to candidates. We will, in the next week or two, probably report to you on the results of an individual level analysis of this voting reform. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dean Stein. Now we have about almost 30 minutes for questions from the commissioners. I see Spencer Overton has already signaled that he has a question, so we'll open it up to questions for any of the panelists. Direct your question either to the panel generally or to one of the particular panelists, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Secretary Baker. I actually had a few very short questions, just wanted to confirm some things. Professor Alvarez wanted to direct the questions to you. I'll move through them quickly because I know other commission members want to ask questions. So my understanding is that there are basically three types of voter ID, right? In we got Category 1 state where there is no photo ID required, where one can sign, for example, to confirm his or her identity. That would be the majority of states. My understanding is that we have another category where there is a safety net. So there's a photo ID requirement, but maybe there's an affidavit that one can sign, or maybe there's a biometric system we heard about last time. For those people who don't bring their ID, they can provide biometric information and cast a ballot. And then I understand there's a third category that that require photo ID, but there's no safety net. In other words, if you don't bring your photo ID to the polls, you can't vote. We don't hear from those people. I want to focus on that third category, this category where there's no safety net, where if you don't have your photo ID, you can't cast a ballot. Now, Professor Alvarez, voter participation is already low in the United States, right? Is that correct? I mean, compared to other Western democracies?
Yes, and it's certainly lower than it has been in the past.
Right. So many nations have universal registration of voters. Mexico, 94% of people are registered, whereas here it's only about 70%. Is that right?
I think that's about right.
Okay.
Something like that.
In terms of these voter ID requirements without safety nets, at least from the data we saw in our materials, about 10% of people who would go to cast a ballot might not have a photo ID and would be excluded. Is that correct?
I haven't seen that information, so
okay.
I can't say anything about it.
Okay, I would just attest it was at least in our materials here. Some communities are hit hard. I've got information that in Georgia, 36% of seniors over 75 don't have driver's licenses. That's 3.7 million disabled Americans don't have an ID. And that in South Dakota, Native American counties, voters there were 8 times more likely not to bring an ID to the polls. Is that, roughly consistent? Are you surprised by any of that data?
Not surprised. Again, it's consistent with what I was trying to allude to in my testimony, that we don't have a clear understanding, I think, of how these various identification requirements, as they're being implemented across the country, are impacting the problems that people face when they go to poll sites to vote, or on turnout rates more generally. And again, I'm not familiar with this data that you've been provided.
Right. So in terms of the fraud that a voter ID would prevent, it's really quite unclear what percentage. Certainly there may be some fraud out there. Indeed, in Milwaukee, there was a study of 70,000 votes, and less than 1% of them were fraudulent. In fact, it was more like 1 out of every 700 of the votes cast caused problems that might be prevented by an ID requirement. Is that right?
I think so. I think from that study, if I recall it correctly. And again, this is an area where I think we really do need some more basic research. You and I have actually talked about this before in other forums, where we don't have a clear understanding about how much voting fraud currently exists. And so that makes it very difficult to speculate as to how some of these new reforms are impacting either fraud or people's ability to participate.
Right. So just kind of as a final question here, and I know we need better data, and we don't have the data, but based on what we do know, the fact that 10% of voters might be excluded, and the Milwaukee study, it's very possible for every single fraudulent vote that a photo ID requirement would keep out. For every single fraudulent vote, 70 legitimate votes might be excluded. Again, we don't have hard numbers, we need better data, but we could end up at the end of the day excluding 70 legitimate votes for every single fraudulent vote excluded. Is that possible?
I think it's certainly possible. Again, I don't know that we actually have the specific data to be able to make that precise calculation. And again, I really do think that we all should be working towards collecting that data and being able to do that kind of analysis so we can better understand the essential trade-off that may be going on in the current system and move towards making the voter registration process both easier and more secure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Spencer. President Carter.
Dr. Hawthorne, I notice you mention frequently the transmission of the signature, which requires some a number of complexities. What would be the deleterious effect, instead of that, of using as a single identifier the last 4 numbers of the Social Security?
Well, with the last 4 numbers of the Social Security, you only have, what's the combinatoric there? 10 times 10 times 10 times 10,000 different combinations. And so now if you combine that, as we do in the states, with the last name,
Yes.
then there must be some, and we need a statistician to tell us, but some possibility that Smith and the last four numbers, is you're going to wind up with the same Smith. The problem there is that if the same Smith now votes in Arizona and Wisconsin, that person will show up as a double voter, and someone will have to track him down and find out what's going on.
But
It just would lead to more false positives, that's all.
But since the amount of fraud is minimal compared to excluding voters, and we need to have simplicity in making the cross-state data available through a central data processing place, don't you think that the name and address and the last four numbers of the Social Security card would effectively eliminate fraudulent duplication?
Well, the address is the problem, because
They change frequently.
they would change, and people also, and I always call this the rich person's way to voter fraud. If you own a house in 2 different states, you can easily prove your address in 2 different states.
But
Now,
just
if you
say-
want to know the percentage of rich people who try to vote twice, I kind of doubt that that's very high. But absolutely, the name plus the last 4 digits, and followed up with people who will actually look into cases where there could be fraud, is entirely possible to do.
Well, that's what we were kind of inclined toward, is a name plus the last 4 digits, which would effectively eliminate duplicate voting.
And if you also included that picture of the signature, which is no different than sending pictures of your grandchildren around. I mean, it's a picture of a signature. And if the people in the 2 different states could look at the 2 signatures and determine whether or not those are the same, that would be another way to catch it, in addition to the name plus the
The Real
4
ID
digits.
legislation already requires a photograph, right, a digitized photograph.
Right. I was kind of hoping to not have to get those photographs into the voter registration databases, because that's another complex step. They already have the signatures, which a lot of the states are currently using, because, I mean, especially if you think of Oregon, which does only absentee voting, they look at that signature, they physically look at the signature on the back of the envelope to
So
make sure it
signatures would be
matches.
better than a photograph.
In my opinion,
I understand.
signatures would be.
That's what I'm asking for,
that's
your
right.
opinion, which I really value.
All right, thank you.
Shirley Malcolm.
A question for Dr. Hawthorne. I really appreciate your testimony, because it gives us a level, I think, of confidence that we may be able to find our way out of the interoperability box. But there's a question about the quality of the databases that are basically being cobbled together. You know, are we basically putting ourselves in a garbage in, garbage out situation when in fact we don't have a lot of confidence in what the structure of the individual databases are within the units that we're trying to glue together?
The databases in the different states differ in their what you would call clean data aspects. And some of them do have very messed up data, in the sense of people on the rolls who have moved years ago. We're trying to clean them up with people who've died. They're actually taking death records and comparing them. Although, you know, the names differ, and you know, it's kind of hard if someone says you're dead and you're trying to vote. But in general, I think that the thing I would not want to recommend ever is throw it all out and start all over. We have what we have. This is life. This is what we have. What we have is databases which in some cases are inaccurate. As we use those databases, as we go on, we will be cleaning up those databases. You see that happening now. You see now with HAVA that the different counties are cleaning up their databases. And so I would not ever, ever, please don't throw all this out and start all over again. In the 35 years I've been in this business, I very seldom have seen a throw it all out and start over again work with the kind of budget and time scale that one would like. So I would take what we have.
So you're suggesting essentially real-time cleanup?
That's what we're doing. That's what
Yeah.
is actually happening at every election, at every time. As these databases start interoperating, you will see people say, oh, those guys in, wherever have terrible data, and then there will be pressure for them to clean it up.
Just 1 minute, but Raul, if I may, while we're on this subject, how would any of you suggest that we require interoperability of state databases?
Well, it has to be a law. There
Okay, all
are
right.
some states who by law cannot share data with other states. It has to be a law. But also, while I've got the floor, I really think you need to get the state secretaries of state involved in some sort of a user group, if you will, to help define how they're going to interoperate so that they can help set the standards.
And would that law have to go so far as to provide how a person moving from Texas to Arkansas would be picked up by Arkansas and dropped by Texas, or would you just leave that to the good offices of both states?
I think what we've seen with HAVA has been that when we don't provide a lot of specificity in the law, that it gets interpreted differently in different states, which can lead to some problems. So personally, I would say you'd want to be definitive in the law. However, I don't know, given states' rights, how far one can go with that.
Secretary, could I chime in on this quickly? Just one more answer on the operability question, interoperability. I'd like to just not, throw out would like to throw out the suggestion that we not focus exclusively on government solutions here. Because one thing that actually did happen after the 2004 election was there was a huge amount of public scrutiny, private scrutiny. People out there, the research crowd, the people out in the blogosphere who were analyzing a lot of this kind of data and finding all sorts of interesting things, some of which turned out to be false, but many of which I think alerted people to many problems. So these databases, if they're made available, say, to the Election Assistance Commission, and researchers could take advantage of the databases. We could do a lot of work essentially for these states to try and find these duplicates across states.
Thank you. Raul, I think you had your hand up, and then Secretary Mosbacher.
Yes, my question is directed to Ken Smuckler. First of all, let me congratulate you on your project. I thought it was very, very contributive to the discussion. You mentioned something that was counterintuitive, that in Latino concentrated areas, they got very few requests for Spanish language assistance. One can draw two conclusions or several conclusions from that. One of them is that there's no need for it. And the other one might be that the monolingual Spanish-speaking voter simply didn't know that that service existed. Do you have an opinion on which of those two might be the correct interpretation?
I do have an opinion on it. First, the national numbers, only less than 3% of the callers coming through the system were choosing the Spanish option. And when you go into the system, in both Our Vote and My Vote, the very first thing that the caller hears is an option to proceed in English or Spanish. So the folks that were coming into the system clearly knew that there was that option. And I can't really explain it to you in areas of high Latino population why it didn't track up higher. When we built this system, I believe that most of the people involved in building the system thought that the Spanish option would take a higher percentage, particularly in high Latino areas, and it didn't. I just raised that as something that was counterintuitive to the designers. It may be very intuitive to people who have studied more about Spanish language options in phone systems or voting systems. It just was counterintuitive to us. And I think it also shows that this data, we have just scratched the surface on the data that has come through the system. I think we could do a lot more analysis in the Latino community to determine what a better system perhaps could be built for Latinos.
Secretary Mosbacher.
particularly for Mr. Smuckler. I noticed in your excellent presentation, you never talked about the rather old-fashioned but traditional way of the voter finding the proper voting place, the local newspapers, the registration points relative to where the potential voter lived, and it does take some initiative on the part of that voter to check those things out. In your view, are those no longer operative, or did you think they were too obvious to
No,
include?
I think the problem is that if you go into a newspaper, the newspaper will take you to a poll location, but you have to have one piece of information that most voters, particularly the intermittent voters, don't have, and that's their precinct number. Yeah. There is no printed database that will take you from a street address, which you do have, to your poll location. And that's why it's easier to almost find any other piece of information in America than find your poll location, because poll locations are driven by precinct. The reason 3 million voters went to mypollingplace.com is because it had the functionality, well, in part because Google hyperlinked it off its homepage, but the reason that happened is because it had the functionality of taking you directly from a street address to a poll location. When I mentioned in my testimony that 9 websites out of 51, not including the territories, could do that, right? What it means is you have 42 Secretary of State websites that if you went to that website, so you can't find it in print because you got to know your precinct number. How do you find your precinct number? You'd have to call your local board, but they're not picking up the phones, right? So you can't find it in print, so now you try and find it online. Well, there are only 9 states where you're going to even be able to plug in an address to find it online, and if you have to put your precinct in, you're back to calling your local board, and they're not answering the phones. What we've done is we have created an information cul-de-sac rather than an information highway for voters. So everybody is running in a loop on election day, and this is the most basic of information. So I tell people is, like, we miss the big thing, right? The most basic information, registration, poll location. If just take down those barriers and more people will vote, and it's not, you know, we built this system for less than a fraction of a percentage of what the state have a budget was for the state of Vermont. And we built it for the entire country.
Imagine that no local newspapers ever carry addresses versus precinct
Correct. A local newspaper, because there are too many local addresses, you'd have an entire newspaper filled with street addresses. So the newspapers do what they can do, which is they'll give you your area and precinct and say, if you live in this area and precinct, you'll go to that poll location. Well, the intermittent voter has no clue as to what their area and precinct is because they're only checking in once every 4 years or twice every 4 years. So it becomes a cul-de-sac. No need for it.
If they did, in general, put the streets and areas in the newspaper?
It would help, but it's easier for them just to publish an 800 number and say, if you want to find your poll location, call the toll-free number, and all you have to do, all we did, we derived a poll location just from getting a home phone number. We took the home phone number, we dipped it into a database, derived a zip9 for it, generated a zip9 to poll location address, and found a poll location. This is not rocket scientists, and you know what? It's not even that expensive. It's just we don't really, it's just there wasn't much focus on it. And may I just, as I continue the diatribe and end it, may I just say this. I think the reason that HAVA didn't speak to this issue is because there was no real data to launch this off of. Right now we have data, right? And so now you can see that people who are coming into the system on election day or the days prior to it, they simply just don't have information a lot of times. They want to vote, they just don't have basic information. So I think it's a relatively easy thing for us to move through, and it's not a costly thing to move through, but it's something we've got to do.
Ralph.
Just one clarification for President Carter and for Ms. Hawthorne, and that is that the western states also are very intent on seeking the signature because we use it for checking initiative petitions. And so it becomes a very valuable part of the system in that respect. Just had one quick question. I'd like to compliment Professor Alvarez on your work. And I just wondered, have you looked at young people at all or talked about that at all, or looked at why there seems to be such a high percentage of young people that are not engaged in this process?
No, but there certainly are. There certainly is a lot of interest in that in the academic room. I think actually Professor Stein may know more about that than I do.
It's in the longer report that I wrote with Jan Legley and Chris, and the answer simply is we call it habit-forming behaviors, and young people haven't yet developed a habit, and therefore older people vote because they voted before. We talk about in the report what would lead people to habit. I think Ken's really spoken to this eloquently. The other is that, and this is not, it sounds heresy, but there's some reason to argue that young people might not have a big incentive to vote. They don't own property. They often don't have jobs.
Yeah.
One of the things we've noticed in Texas, for instance, is young Hispanics were voting by age cohorts at higher rates than their comparable Anglo. Why? Well, because young Hispanics, 18 to 25, were moving to the labor force, getting married, having children, and buying homes here in Texas much quicker. Those are reasons. They're stakeholders. So I'm not suggesting people shouldn't vote, but sometimes it's like buying a car or buying a tie. I mean, you're not unpatriotic if you don't buy things, but somehow we think if you don't vote, sometimes there's a reason for voting, and the logic is that there are so many different elections, people choose them. But young voters haven't developed the habit. And clearly, even registering them at high schools, as we often do in Texas, doesn't give them that habit. So, but I do think Ken's absolutely right. The idea of making these these places the vote.
Sure.
Also keep in mind that many states and our locales change their voting places.
Sure.
So even the most diligent of voters often finds it a tremendous travail to find out where they're going to vote. Again, I'm not an advocate for Walmart or McDonald's, but I think Michael said it perfectly. There's nothing wrong with the private sector. They do things well, and they see nothing wrong with the idea that there be a big banner along our Highway 59 or 95 saying, vote here today. One last thing, be careful what you wish for. Just because we increase turnout doesn't necessarily increase people's knowledge, connectedness, and information. There's lots of scholarly work. Donardo has written on this, a colleague of Michael's, that suggests that sometimes people who turn out may not be any more interested and knowledgeable about voting, and therefore make what we call random votes. So again, it's not a panacea for democracy, but if you want higher turnout, I think Ken's put it very easily. Get people to do the simple things. Election centers are one of them.
I've always been convinced that first property tax statement is a real stimulant to rich.
Very much so.
Betty Castor.
Well, after Mr. Smuckler's diatribe, to all of you, you're all talking in some way or another about the professionalism of the people who are responsible. We had testimony at our first hearing about the tremendous need for professionalism and upgrading of staff in elections offices, whether they're at the local level or the state level. What can you tell us? Obviously, you probably agree. Is anybody making an effort to really address this topic?
I'll take the first crack. I think secretaries of state, county boards of election are trying to do their best to put the most professional face, by and large, to put the most professional face onto their operations. I really do believe that their hearts and their minds are in the right place, and they're moving forward. When we hear the problems that we were hearing over the hotline were not, by and large, problems with people interacting with unprofessional workers at their either at a poll location, well, at a board of election. At poll locations, there are wide varieties, but yes, you're going to have poll workers who simply don't have the appropriate information. The genesis for the hotlines actually came from 2000 in Volusia County, when a guy named Bob Mulholland, who was a big California operative, went to Volusia and found that they had 3 phone lines set up, all rolling into the last line, and the last line was set up for the poll workers to call in if they had problems. So the poll workers were never getting information as to what to do in Volusia, right? So I tend to believe that the way to answer the problem of professionalism at a poll worker, in part, is get these universal vote centers, right? So you need less poll workers. So the burden isn't as great to train that many poll workers. But second, open up lines of communication, open up the information infrastructure. So if poll workers are having problems on the ground, they know where to go and they've got a clean line to get the information.
Yeah, one of the, just to take a quick stab at that as well, to throw a cautionary note into this, one of the wonderful things about being at Caltech is I live in Los Angeles County, and we have one of the most wonderful and professional election administrators there, Connie McCormick. And she consistently will compare the logistics of running an election to a major military mobilization. And it's a good analogy, but it only goes so far, because it's not as if she's the general and she's got everybody divided up in divisions and she's got a clear chain of command. It's actually the opposite. She has very little control over most of her operations, because a lot of what she does is rely on volunteers, polling place workers, and other third parties, like the political parties and other people who are involved in the process, to mobilize voters, to tell them where to go, and to help them as they go to vote. So it's a huge logistical problem. But the problem with it is, even if we push towards more professionalization, which is a good thing, it's only going to go so far as long as election officials are relying on essentially millions of volunteers to help them on Election Day.
We've almost run out of time. We have 3 more commissioners who want to ask questions. Susan Molinari.
Thank you. Very quickly, I think part of the problem, and I'll just speak for myself, but you know, we do have sort of this generation gap in terms of the technology that you're advocating, what we can understand here, and certainly the traditional election worker volunteer. And I mean, let's be frank about it, they're not the 19-year-old whiz kids who get how this all works. And so I'm still having a hard time wrapping my mind around it, and I agree. I remember an election where I was on the ballot and my father was on the ballot, and they changed my polling place, and I couldn't figure out where to go. Now, eventually I got there. But, you know, it was a little disconcerting for me to figure out at that point I had gotten my card in New York, and it didn't tell me where to go, and all my phone calls to the people who took my phone calls as a member of Congress couldn't tell me where to go. So clearly there's some issues there. Now, maybe that's just New York. But how do we get, so I think, you know, this election center is just so fascinating, but we start the testimony with the still inoperability of states being able to communicate with one another, with the lack of confidence that people have that the right thing is being done when people actually go and vote and how votes are counted. How do you wrap that all up into an election center where, particularly in areas like LA or New York, not Larimer, block by block, your voting, your ballot is going to be different based on your local election challenges? How do we get, if you were us, how would you suggest that in this recommendation we help get this country from here to there?
Very quickly, it's in the recommendations. First, as much as I would like, as I'm sure everyone, interoperability across the states, look at the demographics and the census. Our colleague Fry, a demographer at Brookings, the mobility of the populations across the states is nowhere near what the mobility is within the states.
Okay.
Your big problem is in states, interoperability within the states.
Fair
would
enough.
be desirable, and as Paula said, second, these voter centers on Election Day are surely not the panacea. Beverly Kaufman, county clerk here from Harris County, will testify, I think, this afternoon. It would be difficult to pull them off in big urban areas, but not impossible. Second, they are, as the recommendations, dependent upon such things as interoperability, voter ID, not so much for fraud, but simply to get the right ballot to you or your father in the right area. Also, let me point out, the current population survey that's done every year after the presidential election, 50,000 sample survey, I looked at the people who also said one of the problems they had with voting was they got no help. complaints about poll workers. Now, these aren't big numbers, but 3% cited poll workers as a problem in the states that did not have electronic voting. 7% cited it as a problem in states that had some type of electronic voting. So if we're going to move in this direction, you can see these numbers are not big, but they're twice as many problems. I'm not suggesting we have all the answers on this election center, and as I cautioned, I'd like to do some more work before your September meeting, but the evidence would suggest that they're at least, as Ken suggested, they're a no-brainer. They're not a rocket science. It's helping people get to places. And again, I'll say it like Michael did. Look at what private sector does. When Men's Warehouse in Houston wants to get people to go to their cleaners, they know how to get them there. We don't have government that will implement this. You have to use the parties, but the parties will compete. Use their ambition to win to make it into a win-win. I'm not saying the electorate will be necessarily 10 or 15% larger, but it might work much better than any of the other things that we've tried before.
Thank you, Bob. President Ladner.
Mr. Secretary, quick question. It's a big picture question. A number of you left the impression, and it wasn't cavalier at all, so I don't denigrate it, but that if we could just get a few professors in a room and solve some of this technology infrastructure stuff, my experience is you get 3 professors, you get 4 definitive contradictory opinions. But be that as it may, are you leaving the impression that, wow, we just need to catch up with what's going on in technology research here? And leaving politics aside, my question is, what is the big picture? If we could say there are technological solutions we're not aware of, are we looking at, if we were to implement them, get professors in a room, whatever, 2 or 3 years of really cleaning all this stuff up, not throwing out the databases, not so on. We can solve these problems. Is it a political issue that keeps us from this? Let's assume this commission, as I and many have had experience in running big bureaucracies in which you find out the technology people say, you know, this will do it. And you spend millions of dollars and you've got many more problems than you thought, et cetera. What are we looking at in the big picture here?
If I could take a first of all I wanted to say is that the technology is not the drawback. That is, technology is available to do what you need to do. If what you need to do, and my opinion is what you need to do, is to make it so that people don't have to vote in their precinct, but can vote at a center, can vote someplace else. If what you need to do is that, then you need to have the interoperating databases of the different jurisdictions so that if someone shows up at the wrong precinct, they can vote there. How do they need to do that? Well, they need to get the right ballot there. That's available via some of the election machine technology. You know you can do that. The technology is available. The question really is around the politics, right? I mean, so why do people have to vote in their precincts? Why can't they vote universally? That's to me the interesting, the major question is the political question, is not the technological question. I didn't mean to say if you just do the technology, you'll do it right. I meant to say it's not a problem.
Thank you. Senator Daschle.
For the first time in history, we passed legislation in HAVA that authorizes a commission to assist with elections and to try to promote greater participation and greater accuracy. And I'd be interested in your assessment of their performance so far and what, if any, changes you'd make in the longer term to give the commission the authority it needs to do its job.
Well, I think the biggest issue was they got started way too late, and they've been seriously underfunded. There's an enormous amount of, I think, really exciting calls to them in HAVA for research. A lot of these kind of questions that have come up today, had they been fully funded, we probably would know at least better answers to. So I think the quick answer here is let's give them some more time to do their work, but make sure that they have the resources that they need.
I've been in conversations with a local school district, which the university does a lot of work for, on bond elections, and I suggested that they experiment with election centers. and they were eager to do it. They didn't have all the resources, but I think if HAVA, as Michael said, were able to give out small amounts of monies just to experiment with ideas and see if they work. In the last 20 years since the motor voter bill was passed, we've seen this tremendous proliferation of voting by mail, a whole host of efforts. But as Michael points out, we don't get a really good experimental opportunity to study them. I think I'm finding, and we'll probably do it here in the Houston area with one of these local school districts where low turnout, your bond elections where people, we're not looking for millions. It's just I think if HAVA were to offer this up and give them legal immunity, that's the big problem. As I'm sure Mr. Overton will say, you start making changes on election procedures, you can get into lawsuits. If there was some immunity from experimenting at danger, I think they would try it, and we'd have more evidence than we frankly can bring to you today.
Federal immunity, state immunity, that's a big question. Thank you very much, Bob. We'll take a 15-minute recess, and we'll reconvene at 10:20.
If I could just say that, as Secretary Baker says, we'll take a 15. The next section is going to be dealing with voting machines, and I'd like to ask if the commissioners could come back in 10 minutes, because we will then have an opportunity to have a hands-on a chance to look at the machines, and the audience does not need to reconvene until about 10:35 or 10:40. Okay? Thank you. Sorry.
10:35.
Yeah.
Well, you got it down here 10:15 to 11.
Yeah. No. The first 15, 20 minutes will be the commission members.
You did tell me, but then I didn't.